should be fine. So let's start with the basics first. This is the agenda. We're going to talk about the date components. We're going to talk about common date operations in C#. We're going to talk about the current date usage, which is what I just talked about at ResNet. And I'm going to, based on my knowledge of dates, which is still quite limited, to provide some best practice tips for everyone here. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the date components. So look at these questions. You may think it's an easy question to answer, but depending on where you are in the world, it's actually quite different, right? So what day is it today? We are here on 23rd, but maybe some place on the world is not. And what time is it now? Sonali, Ramya might have a different date than ours. And time zone, of course, not the same. And the current time zone offset, depending on what day are you in, right? So all these sort of things are actually complicated. And people tend to think in their own location and in their own status to say, okay, this is the time, this is day. But think about globally and think about we are dealing with the clients everywhere. So it's important for us to actually have the concept of asking those questions. Where is this date located? And there are some date terminologies. I believe everyone should be quite familiar with these things. Date is just date. Date time contains a time, midnight, time zone, and offset, right? So actually, there's something different from time zone and offset, which I'm going to cover later. But this one, like these things, I find sometimes people get confused. GMT, UTC, universal time, they're all the same, meaning the offset equals 0. And that's the server time we're using for all the dev test servers and production servers. And here's another thing, which is the elapsed time. So this is the time duration. So this can be more than 24 hours. Basically, it's just counting how long the time has gone. And people always use the iOS 8601 standard. It's the most commonly used one because it's using this format, which is quite clear, which is the month, which is the day, which is the year, etc. And it's using the full date, so it's 4-digit date. So we can see sometimes the US format is month first and day second, year last. This will make people feel very confused. And there's one thing we need to pay a little bit attention to, which is the previous dates. So basically, any date before this day might not be accurate, might not be as accurate as we think it might be, because this is kind of the standard date time when we start to have the standards, right? So before the standards, there's no standard, if that makes sense. Yeah. And how the date and time is stored in computers. Usually they are stored in integers, like what we have seen in Excel. If you hover on a date and you try to change the format to numbers, you can actually see some numbers there. So that's how Excel is storing the date internally. And there are different precisions, and it differs in languages. So here's some just calculations and how all these things are working. And we might want to look at .NET. It's using tick, which in a tick, it's 1 with 7 zeros ticks. 1 second equals to 10 to the power of 7 ticks. Yeah, usually we don't count this, but this is the smallest number of the time unit in .NET. Okay, so I mentioned the time zone and offset are not the same things, which is because one time zone can have different offset. We have the daylight saving time, and one offset can obviously have multiple time zones, right? So yeah. So basically, when you talk about time zones, it can get very confused because the daylight saving times actually change every year, and sometimes governments choose to change it just 1 year after, right? But I think in our portal, we are usually using offset to make it more consistent. But yeah, I don't think we need to be too obsessed with these concepts. Just need to have this mindset of these things are actually different. And yeah, and also interestingly, the time zone names are also not standard. Some people think the IANA time zone database is the most commonly used one, but that's not supported in native.NET. So yeah, if you want to know all the time zones, it's better to check the documentation. Okay, and this is the difficult part. The daylight saving times. It's not usually +1 or -1 hour. It doesn't happen every time the same, every year the same time, and it can happen more than once a year, and it's very unpredictable. So we shouldn't hard code anything with daylight savings in our applications. And usually it has the forward transition and the fallback transition. So for example, in the spring forward transition, we have 1 hour forward. So the transition day actually only have 23 hours. So we miss 1 hour. And this is okay. Daniel has a question.
Yes, I just wanted to add something on there, which is that we don't usually use daylight saving time. So if someone says to you, hey, we're going to use, like, instead of AEST, we're going to use AEDT, you probably need to tell them, no, we're going to use AEST, right? Because that's not really how it works, and it's just dangerous going into that level. So just try and get the standardized time zone and avoid daylight savings altogether.
Yes, so use offset, basically.
That being said, offset doesn't help you, right? Because if I say AEST offset is 10 and AEDT offset's 11, you still want to use 10, right?
Yeah.
So we still need to be careful on that.
Yeah. It is complicated. Anyway, this is the spring forward. We miss 1 hour, but we usually get back another hour on the fallback transition day. So this might cause some issue. And interestingly, midnight is not always reliable because some time zones tend to change their daylight saving on the midnight, right? Because we kind of lose or add 1 hour. That's why if you're using a local time and you're trying to use date plus midnight time, maybe that's not available or it's getting repeated. So it's not a safe thing to use. What we can do, maybe we only need the date. We don't need the time. Then we only store the date, right? And if we want to make sure the midnight is available, always use UTC daytime. Okay, and in terms of different times, now we have local times, we have UTC times, etc. So all these things we actually need to consider whenever we are reading, saving, converting, calculating, or comparing dates in our applications. You always need to ask the question, whose date is it, right? And for the user perspective, you can't count on the user to understand UTC daytime because no one thinks that way. So to do globalization or to display some daytime on your application, you should use the local user time. And that makes sense. So for the server time, we should avoid using local time because it will cause issue. But sometimes as developers, our local machine is actually using our local time, right? Which means during the development or the debugging, for example, when I was doing the API thing, it actually gets changed based on my machine setting and etc. So this can get very unpredictable and complicated. But maybe if you're doing something very sensitive about the time zone, try to change your machine's time zone to be the GMT is a safe way of doing it. So yeah, this is what I just explained. We're going to skip this. Special considerations, always complicated with dates. So whenever you are dealing with dates, be extremely careful. And now we're going to look at the common date operations in C#. So there are several structs and related classes in C#. For example, DateTime, DateTime offset, time span, which is the duration I just mentioned. And there are other classes to help us to get more information, for example, the time zone. But in C# we don't have date, right? So if you only want to get date, you can't. You can only get the date time and then get the date from that. And we don't have time only. So sometimes people need to still use this thing and ignore the date, only get the time, etc. Or use timestamp. But in that case, you need to be careful to handle the more than 24 hours and negative, negative values cases, because timestamp is not actually the hours in days. And let's look at some code. So if you look at these difference, this one is trying to get datetime now. This one is datetime offset now. And we also have UTC now and UTC now for each of the classes, right? And if you look at the output and you look at this one, so if I don't tell you which method I use and I show you this time, can you tell whether it's a UTC now or it's local now? Is it possible to tell just by looking at this? That's a question. Guys, Brayden, you seem to know dates.
I mean, well, okay. If it's a local now, it's going to include the 10 hours. So you could subtract 10 hours from it to find what.
So you don't know whether we are using this.
Exactly,
one.
You don't. You can't just by looking purely at the date. You could try to guess, but it probably wouldn't be very useful in the scope of entire application.
Yeah, so that's the point I want to make here, because if you actually use the date time offset now, you can see the time zone there, and you can easily tell whether it's a local now or a UTC now, right? But if you are using datetime, it's very hard. It's just making our life much harder. And yeah, so whenever possible, we should use datetime offset instead of datetime. And here's something more complicated. So datetime has something called kind, because people find, okay, I can't actually tell whether it's UTC or local, right? So when you create, let's just try to run this. I don't know whether any of you guys have done this before, but oh no, this is not what I want to show. Okay, this is another slide. Yeah, wait. Okay. So okay. There's something called kind, and this thing, if you use the default, let me just try to get the. I think I used to have one slide for that, but I don't know why it's now not here. Anyone knows whether it's going to be a local kind or UTC kind or other kind if I run this? Oh, Ramya has a question, or you want to answer it?
No, I have a question. So this slide, I mean the previous slide also what you are explaining, right? So that happens at the time of development, right? So when we only, right? Or does it have anything once it is developed, when we do the updates in the database, it will not have any impact on it, right?
No, it is not always.
Shiraz, you're saying something?
No, it is always, right? Any time you use it, it is going to impact it. Doesn't matter at what point.
No. What I was asking is once the time zone or what it is in UTC or local, it is set in the database will show that, and we will be using the same format for updating. So there will not be any. Once it is set, there will not be any change in that zone, in the database.
Yeah, I think, if I remember correctly, for Invoker, the output date format usually have the time zone at the end. Is it correct? If it doesn't have a time zone, when you update it, you can treat it as UTC. That's my advice. If it has a time zone of +10, when you update, you should always update to the same time zone.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, where am I? Okay, I think no one answered that question, but yes. So if you are creating a date time and you're just giving the time, the kind becomes unspecified, which means .NET doesn't know whether it's a local time or a UTC time, right? Which makes sense. And you can create date time by giving it a kind of local or UTC. I don't think anyone is doing this, but we can do it to be more specific. Yeah. And for the date-time offset, we can create a time span and then add it to this this constructor to give it a time zone offset, right? So here's another question: does date-time offset have kind? Why or why not? I think Asenti knows dates.
I think it has.
I can't hear you. It's worse.
Asenti, yell into the microphone.
Oh, holding it right here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My answer is yes.
You think it has a kind? It has a kind?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Means no.
The answer is no. Sorry. Basically, let's think about why daytime has a kind, right? The reason why it has a kind is because we can't tell whether it's a UTC time or local time because it doesn't have the time zone, right? But for daytime offset, it already has that information. So it's either +00 or plus something. So it's very explicit. You don't need another thing called kind to say what it is, if that makes sense. So it doesn't. But yeah, I didn't know that as well.
It's sometimes called a naive time, a naive daytime.
Naive daytime, what's that?
Yeah, it's often what's called as because it's naive. It doesn't know what type it is.
Ah, yeah.
So the worst thing you can do is compare a naive one to one that isn't naive. It will just
yeah.
Like if you compare UDC to something that doesn't know, I even think some languages just don't make it work. I don't even know if it works in C#, but probably.
Yeah, we are going through that later. So.
Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah. So we've seen all these kinds, right? And we can update the kind. If you know this is a UTC kind, you can update it, and you can also get the daytime from the offset. Where is it? Yeah. So this one is creating a UTC now from this, and then you can use the UTC daytime from this object we created to get the kind, and it is UTC, right? Which makes sense. But if you are using daytime from the daytime offset, and then you check the kind, it's unspecified. So this is getting complicated because if you don't have the UTC daytime, the output will be some kind that it doesn't know, right? So avoid using this. That's the main message. Use UTC daytime if you want to get something from the daytime offset. And okay, another question. We have a daytime object and we don't know its created time zone. We want to convert it to a daytime offset object with the time zone equals to UTC. What would you do? I think based on time limit, I'm going to show you guys the answer because I've got too many slides. Yeah, so what we can do is we can set the kind to UTC, right? Because we give it the kind and then it knows it's UTC, right? And then we just cast it to be a daytime offset. So that's how you can convert if you know a daytime is a UTC. Another way of doing it is convert it to universal time and then, okay, what's this? And then give it the kind of UTC. It's actually doing the same thing, just trying to give it the UTC kind. And we have another question here. If you have a daytime object and you know its time zone is UTC +8, I chose it because I don't want it to be +10. Sometimes it's easy to get the local time. And you want to convert it to a daytime offset object with its correct time zone. What would you do? And the answer is you can actually try to use this time zone info find system time zone by ID, and you need to provide the correct time zone ID. And then you just assign it So this is one of the methods I find. I don't know whether there's other better methods to do, but this is actually going to cause issue because if you notice, we're using time zone, right? But here we're saying the offset. So we don't know whether it's China Standard Time or other place standard time, right? Maybe we're getting the correct +8, but maybe we're setting a wrong time zone. So all these complicated things can happen. So what we have learned here, there is a risk that your conversion somehow went wrong and you mess up with the offset. So always try to create dates with explicit time zone offset if you already know that's a local time, right? Don't create DateTime and try to convert it again. And avoid ambiguity is the key to avoid mistakes. So we've just covered one of the common scenario, which is convert DateTime to a DateTime offset. And now we're going to convert a DateTime offset to a DateTime. Yeah, so one straightforward solution would be directly get the DateTime from the offset. So you're going to do something like this, right? But the problem is that you're going to get the DateTime with the kind of unspecified. So even it seems like a local now, it's going to be unspecified kind after doing this .DateTime. And this is going to give you headache later because this DateTime has lost its information about kind. Yeah, so all these things tried. This one is even, you know, it's UTC now because when you created it, it's UTC time DateTime offset. But then if you call this method, it's going to mess up. So don't use it. That's the advice. Okay, so that's what I said. And then we can also try to convert it to UTC DateTime, right? Like use this ToUniversalTime and then get UTC DateTime. And then we can actually get the correct type of the kind of UTC. So then we can actually try to convert it to a DateTime by what am I doing? By adding some hours. If you want to convert something UTC to a local DateTime, you need to add the offset, right? And then you also need to change the kind to be local because otherwise it thinks it's still UTC, but actually you added that offset. So there's some complication. Yeah. And okay, what's this? Okay, so there's another way of converting to a different time zone. So what we can do is the same thing that I said, the find system time zone by ID, but still we need to change the kind. So the kind is actually the big hole that you don't want to touch. Okay, so there are some problems as well. You don't know what does local mean, basically. If you change the kind to local, is it Australian local or is it China local? Because actually we are trying to convert it to +8, right? So when you say local, what local it is, you never know that. That's why we try to avoid doing that. So this is one of the solutions I can think of. I think that's the best one for now, but maybe you guys have better solutions. So we can actually get the local DateTime. Okay, Daniel has a question.
Yes, I just wanted to ask. So when you convert DateTime offset to DateTime, right, and you don't specify a type, an offset, right? What does that? It means it's unspecified in the kind, right? But does it do the minusing of or the plussing of the offset to get the correct value, or is it not that smart?
Okay, so you have a DateTime offset. Do you have it to be UTC?
Let's say, yeah, let's say it's not UTC. Let's say it's AST. So plus 10 hours is the offset. And I'm just going to, without thinking, convert it to DateTime.
Yeah.
Right. So I just do like a .DateTime on that date specifically. Right. So the kind I don't set, I don't change anything. Right. Does it just copy paste like the first part of the DateTime offset into that value?
Oh, it's going to do some convert.
So it's going to convert. It's going to minus 10 hours or plus 10 hours, whichever one it does, and give me the UTC time?
Yeah, it's based on your current local machine's time zone offset, actually. If it's
Yeah.
10, then it's going to minus 10.
Okay, but
Yeah.
so if it did match what I had in my date, it would just take the date straight off, right? It would go, this is the actual date. It's already in the correct format, so just use it.
Yeah.
If my local was in UTC, it would then convert to UTC. So we should avoid that because we don't want it to be local.
Yeah, we don't want the kind to be local or unspecified. It can be UTC. That's the only good one. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so where am I? Yeah, so because DateTime have 3 kinds and we don't like that, so we actually need to get a local DateTime offset object instead of trying to convert it directly to a DateTime. And we also recommend to use UTC now, not the now. That's already covered. And what's this? We should avoid using DateTime object to represent a local time. We should always get it from the DateTime offset. And you should use the convert time to convert time zone. Don't try to create new time offset by yourself. So basically, I'm saying don't try to add hours by yourself. Always try to use this method to get the time zone. Yeah, because if you are adding or subtracting, the time zone might not be correctly recorded in that object. So if you're using this, then it's like using an interface, right? Someone already implemented. So this is the solution I come up with. So I first get the UTC now. And then what's this? UTC DateTime. Then the kind is UTC. And then I try to, because I need to use a DateTime and then give it a time zone offset. I can't just use this UTC offset to give it a time zone. That's why I created that. And then I can use this method that I already discussed to give it a correct time zone. And if you want to get the DateTime, you just call the DateTime method local, right? And don't save it into another variable. Just use it when you need it. That's the solution.
When you're using the time zone info, right? The function that you are using, right?
Yeah.
Does that affect that? Is that affected by the daylight savings? Because you're actually specifying a culture and not an exact offset.
What do you mean?
Like you're specifying China standard zone, right? Standard time, right? Would that take the daylight savings into account? If it does, it's going to change between this one.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually,
Daylight saving times is not standard. Standard time is before daylight saving time. So, for example, AEST is Australian Standard Time.
Yeah, so it would
has
be
a different name.
China Daylight Time or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. And then you also have like multiple forms of daylight savings time too in some places where like it increases by like an hour, then maybe another half hour, and so on, and then goes back by 2 hours, and then goes forward by half an hour. So it depends.
Yeah, but I think the standard time should be a fixed time zone offset, so we're safe in that sense.
Hopefully.
Yeah, Shiraz, does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Let's move on. Okay, then we have these 2 methods, ToUniversal time and ToLocal time. And depending on your kind, it can act very weirdly. So if sometimes I can't remember what I did now, maybe we can just try to run it. Okay. Oh yeah, so you guys still remember when I do this, it's actually an unspecified kind, right? Because I didn't say what it is. So if I run it and to UTC, to local, so it's actually going to subtract 10 hours. So if it's to UTC, it's assuming this one is my local time, if it makes sense. So it's actually going to minus 10 hours from the original date because the original one is not UTC, right? And then, but you look at this, when you're saying to local, it's adding another 10 hours, right? Because it says now I'm unspecified. I still don't know what's the time zone it is. So it just gets very messy. And then it's actually not the same as the original datetime anymore as well. So don't use that. That's the period. Yeah, and this one will also cause some issue. I think the only safe one is UTC, but sometimes when you do some conversion, the kind gets changed, right? So these are the summary. So if it's UTC, conversion is correct. If it's
I'm going to have to drop off.
Right?
Yeah, Kylie is calling. I'll drop off.
I'm dropping off. Am I still here?
No, Luna. Shraf said he has to go. He's getting a call. I think it's a prod thing.
Okay. Bye, Shiraz. You're already gone.
He's gone.
Yeah. So yeah. These are the summaries. Have a read at this. But if it's local and you somehow change your time zone offset, it will still become unreliable. Avoid using datetime as much as possible. That's my personal advice, unless the kind is UTC, because I got too confused about these things. Okay, now the conversion. I think this might be the easiest one because we all have experienced this. Sometimes we need to format datetime object to a string. Sometimes we need to pass a string and convert it to a datetime object. So just have a look. I think this is the standard format. If you see a Z at the end, it means it's UTC. And it's fine to use +00 as well. Yeah, and you can also use a shortcut or shorthand of O means the complete format, and S means a strict format. Yeah, so basically these are all the methods we have, and yeah, it's just a list of the methods we have. Yeah, what's this? Okay, so this is the O format. So if you try to convert a datetime to O format, it will become something like this, right? So this is just giving you guys some example. So parsing, try parse will handle the errors. Parse will just fail, which is not good. And if you use parse exact, it needs to have the exact format. And that's why we are having issue now for the invoker. Okay, so I don't want to go into detail now because I think most of us have experienced this. Date comparison. Common scenarios, compare dates, compare datetime, compare datetime offsets. So the first rule of this is to compare, we need to make sure they're in the same time zone, right? If they're in different local time zones, we need to make sure we convert them to UTC time and then compare. So that's the rule of thumb. So if you look at this, I don't know, another example. If we, okay, I think this one I was trying to demonstrate if you are using a local time and you are subtracting 1 hour and you compare that with UTC now, it's actually going to give you a wrong result because think about the time, right? Even if you subtract 1 hour, your local time cannot be, after the UTC now, if that makes sense. So the time actually gets messed up because your local is in the future, basically. So don't compare 2 times in different time zones. Always convert them to the same time zone or always try to use UTC. And yeah, and datetime offset is better. It doesn't have
it's not what we would do in production, so it's not a very real test anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Best practice. I think I've already said too many best practice to you guys, but first understand the difference and daylight saving time. Don't hard code it. Avoid using local datetime in your database and application internal logic. UTC datetime offset is the best option. I don't recommend the datetime UTC because you can't tell whether it's local or UTC, right? We just extend that. So offset is the best option, in my opinion. Don't compare date in different time zones. Use O or this for formatting because that's the standard thing people usually use. And be careful when you are talking to even the BAs or I mean other people about days, like today, next week, yesterday. Maybe in their context, it's different from what you're thinking. And lastly, I watched this Pluralsight course. I think it's a quite good one. It's actually covering a lot of best practice, common mistakes, or even how we calculate age. I think there's a better way mentioned in the course. Oh, this is new. There's an ad. Yeah, so have a look at it if you somehow get the license from Ascenti, and I think it will help you a lot. Okay, I think that's it. We actually covered a lot of things. I didn't go very detailed into the C# code because I kind of want to cover everything. And if I go too much into detail, we won't have enough time. But thanks. I hope this is helpful. At least you know how complicated it is. Do we have any questions?